Hey folks, welcome to this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast and Pitch the Podium. And this one is a special episode. We're in the lead up to the USGP, and Kunal and I were wondering, well, has Formula One finally cracked the code in the USA? And we thought, well, our perspective on it might be a little bit a far-fetched one, maybe one from the outside. So let's actually get someone who's been in the sport for so long, who knows exactly what's going on, and probably you can call him the voice of F1 in the US. Not probably, I think certainly you can do that. Before we get down to that though, let's actually have a quick word with Kunal about what we're going to have today and what's in store for you on this episode of the Inside Line F1 podcast and Pitch the Podium. So there, Kunal, how is it going for you? A bit of an off weekend of sorts, not having Formula One in must be far, far lighter this time.
It's been a bit of an off weekend, yes, Somil, but we've spent the time trying to do different programming on the podcast for the American Grand Prix. And I know a lot of our listeners are literally just like, okay, can the two of you please let Mr. Bob Varsha just do all the talking? So usually I'm the one who has the privilege of introducing the guest, Somil, but I think, Somil, you're better placed to introduce Bob, since I know you have actually met him in person as well.
That's right. Very briefly, unfortunately, that was at the Hong Kong Grand Prix of 2017, just outside the accreditation center. But it begins before that, because I was listening to the Formula E broadcast since it began, basically. And I heard that, wow, there's this one big booming voice starting out the broadcast, having a great sense of calmness about everything and giving you a good overview of what's going to happen. I was like, yeah, I don't know how, but I just have to meet him and the commentary team. And luckily that did happen, just out of the blue within a couple of years' time. And there we are. But things have come full circle because, guys, I'm so grateful for this. But we've got Mr. Bob Varsha, the voice of Formula One in the USA. I think over 20 odd years, I think even longer for Speed F1. And also you've done, Formula E, you've done power boats, you've done every sort of sport that one can possibly imagine. Such a pleasure having you on, sir.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
And honestly, so the first thing we all have to ask you is, how are you doing health-wise? Because we all heard that you were diagnosed with cancer early last year. And hopefully the sign is good. To see you back on the racetrack this weekend was a big positive.
Yes, thank you. It's been a rocky road in my treatment of almost 2 years now. Prostate cancer is my specific ailment, but the doctors are optimistic, and so am I. I'm on a treatment plan that has me in remission right now, and fingers crossed, and we'll hope for the future. But right now, I'm feeling good about things, and I'm delighted to be back at work because that really helps.
Wow, that's honestly so good to hear. So seriously, we all felt a little bit of a heart sink when we heard that, but to hear that you're in remission now, just great to see. Honestly, good stuff. And hopefully more things are available down the road. And I hear that already you've got Extreme E on the calendar and things are just looking bright now, thankfully.
Yeah, it's true that out of sight, out of mind. And so it has been a little bit difficult correcting the record, if you will. I mean, a lot of people think he has cancer, that's that, which fortunately, given modern medical treatment technology, is not always the case. Although I advise everybody, certainly males in my age group and even younger, to get checked for prostate cancer because it is epidemic around the world and has been for a long time. So don't ignore the signs. But that took me off the stage, you might say, for quite a while. And getting back on, frankly, is difficult. I'm not ashamed to admit I am 70 years old now, kind of old news in a lot of ways, I suppose. But I really feel that my experience and my, the gravitas I can bring to a broadcast hopefully will make people have a second look at me, and we'll get back out there. You mentioned all the sports. In my ESPN days in the 90s, yeah, I did all kinds of motorsports and gymnastics, track and field, which was my personal background, and swimming and roller disco fishing and World Cup skiing and skating and all that kind of stuff. And I loved it. That variety of sports was a real challenge. The thing you need to know about my background is I was never meant to be a television broadcaster. I went to law school. I was practicing law here in my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, when I was invited onto a broadcast because of my background in running, which was very popular in the 70s, as you probably know. So I did the broadcast with the folks at Turner Broadcasting here in town. Thought that was the end of it. We shook hands, walked away, and about 6 weeks later, they phoned me up and asked me if I wanted a part-time job working at the then new CNN networks. So I took it and tried to practice law and be a TV guy at the same time, which did not work at all. So I rolled the dice and decided I'd have a television career, and it was just the right time amidst the right opportunities. And I've spent the next 40 years doing this. I've been very lucky, and I'm very grateful for the success I've had thus far. But it's been a great ride.
And I'm so glad that we got to see some of it back here in India as well, because honestly, how would we have even known? Because Speed TV doesn't even come in. But so glad to be sharing this stage with you, sir. And about Formula One, it's an interesting thing, right? You never quite, as I've heard on a couple of other podcasts, you never quite had this love for motorsport first. You knew it existed, but your first interaction with Formula One back in the day was when you got your job at ESPN, I suppose, and when you were told
That's
that
right.
like, this is one sport you've got to do. And what was the culture like back then, sir? Of course, totally different in a way I can imagine, but no social media. It's hard to imagine that today, but at least for a generation of my age. But no social media. It's all press related. Mostly what you see on TV is what you get. Well, what was it like, the Formula One culture back in the US?
Oh, it was very different. Of course, the United States has a history and a long one in Formula One. I believe the USA has held Formula One at more different locations than any country in the world, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. But when I came into the sport, maybe I should start at the beginning. I was not a student of motorsports. I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. As I mentioned, I went into the law. I was, just your basic sports fan, watching games on TV and all that sort of thing. So I didn't prepare for a career in broadcasting, and certainly not in broadcasting sports. But as I said, I was very lucky, right time, right place, got great opportunities. And that became the challenge that really directed my career, that I was presented with a new sport month in and month out, and I'd have to gear up. I'd have to learn about it. Who are the stars? What is the history? What's involved? Fortunately, what I do as a host, play-by-play guy, really doesn't change much from sport to sport. And that's a secret I'm giving away. It's just between us. It doesn't change that much. Get us on the air, in and out of commercials if you're in that kind of environment like the United States. Point out what we're doing, why it's important, who the stars are. As for what the athletes are actually doing at any given moment, I have an analyst, a color commentator with me, an ex-athlete, a blue ribbon sports star, and they make the value judgments, if all goes well, about whether what's happening out there is good, bad, or indifferent. So that has helped me move around among sports, and really, I think, helped in my development as a broadcaster to have all those opportunities and all the different wonderful analysts I've worked with. Of course, guys like David Hobbs and Derek Bell are the ones I'm most closely associated with, but I've been in there with pro football players in America, with Olympic gold medalists in track and field and skating and other sports. So I've had the very best on-air tutorial, if you will, as I'm learning about the sports with these great athletes. So that helped a lot. As far as Formula One goes, in 1987, ESPN was broadcasting live coverage of Formula One, and the host was Sir Jackie Stewart, if you can imagine.
Yeah.
But Jackie was unable to go to the Austrian Grand Prix in 1987 in Spielberg. And so I was drafted in. Can you go to Austria and do a Formula One race? And I thought, well, okay, I've never done Formula One before, but we had 26 cars or so then. How hard can it be? 90-minute race. This place is fast. This will be fine. So I get an airplane, go to Austria, and I preside over the very first Formula One race featuring 2 red flags. And the race wound up taking about 4.5 hours to complete.
Goodness.
Cars lined up, lights went out, down the stretch they went, and wound up in a big steaming pile at the first turn. Unravel everything. Everybody go get your backup cars. We'll do it again. About an hour or so later, they line them up. Off they go. Same point on the racetrack, another big steaming pile of race cars. So fortunately, I was working with legendary American broadcaster Chris Economaki, and my pit guy, John Bisignano. And both guys are very experienced and love to talk. So the 2.5 to 3 hours before we completed a green flag lap went by fairly quickly. But the thing that I'll always remember was walking out of the track in Spielberg after this hard-fought event. I walked out with Nigel Mansell, who had won the race, and was basically walking out in his driver's suit, carrying his helmet, headed for the helicopter. And can you imagine doing that these days? I mean, it was just so much more simple. In a way, we're kind of sentimental about those old days. I mean, you've seen video on boards of drivers with a steering wheel in their hand, and there's nothing on it but the brand logo of their manufacturer. And the interesting thing to me is it was still every bit as quick, every bit as high tech, every bit as dangerous as Formula One now in this age of a steering wheel with 35 different adjustments on it and hundreds, if not thousands, of combinations. So technically, it's a much more sharp-edged sport right now. In terms of social media, we all have to be a bit more careful, but at the same time, we can dig so much deeper in terms of preparation for talking with listeners during a broadcast. When I started in the 80s, and I did my first full season in 1989 with David Hobbs, back then you read magazines and you read reports and you read books and you read everything you could find about Formula One. But then the internet came in and that changed everything. You had so much access to so much more in-depth information, and that made things much easier as well as a little more delicate.
And in terms of the US, of course, the internet and everything came in. The whole world got to be the whole world, of course, was presented with this whole barrage of Formula One, and that, thankfully for nerds like us, has been a big positive. But what was the reaction back then, early on in the days? Because America, well, there is a love for Formula One. Let's just put it very clearly. But there is also a love for other sort of motorsports, and that's a known fact these days, right? There's NASCARs, there's Indy cars, which is now trying to be more of a road course series, which is also very fun to see. But I can imagine it must have been a bit of a niche, and to see it transform now, there's of course a growing spark. But back in the day, I can imagine how rare it must have been like. And what was the reaction you received as, say, a Formula One broadcaster back in the day?
Well, it was a niche sport in many ways, even though Formula One had been on and off in the United States since the 1950s at places like Sebring and Riverside and what have you. The longest stretch we had was, of course, in Watkins Glen, New York for about 20 years. So there was certainly an awareness of Formula One, but it was, other than those occasional events in the United States, it was always over there. It was in Europe, or it was in Asia, or somewhere else. And I'm not sure if American fans were even aware of the enormous popularity of the sport elsewhere. It's a bit like... it's a bit like soccer, I suppose, in its way, that this is a world sport that may visit the United States, but you have to make an effort to seek it out as it takes place everywhere else in the world. And as you mentioned, we had so many other options. You know, we had a target-rich opportunity to watch all those other forms of motorsports, including the ability to go out to your local dirt track or whatever it might be and watch the action in person. You really had to seek out Formula One, which very quickly became a live broadcast sport in the United States. And of course, that made things even worse because so many of the races happened at 0 dark 30, and you really had to be diligent in order to find it. But it has grown enormously. Lots of reasons for that, including the internet and the television broadcast quality and all the other things. Certainly the Netflix film Drive to Survive is credited right now with a huge uptick in American television response. And lo and behold, now we have a second race coming on board. In addition to Circuit of the Americas in Austin, next year's schedule includes the Miami race. And that'll be huge because Miami is perhaps our most international city.
Exactly that. And this just brings us on to an interesting topic you touched upon. Now, US, as you rightly mentioned, has a history of having so many different circuits where there was a try. There was Dallas, there was Phoenix, and there's a ton of them. Las Vegas as well, unfortunately, whatever they tried to do at the Caesars Palace Hotel. But why do you think it never quite worked properly? Because there was always attempts. There was never just one a concrete solution like the Circuit of the Americas is turning out to be now?
Well, I suppose there's lots of reasons for that. One was the accessibility. Another was the absence of any strong American presence in Formula One in terms of teams and drivers. Many superstar American drivers, well, maybe not many, but a few put a toe in the water with a Formula One test. I mean, guys like Bobby Unser and Rick Mears and Jeff Gordon and all of these drivers tested for Formula One, and for one reason or another may have gotten the job, may not. Rick Mears said he was blackballed by Nelson Piquet at Brabham in the day. So there's always those factors of personality and Formula One versus two drivers and all that sort of thing. But in the end, it comes back to the fact that the United States is so rich in motorsports that the Al Unser Juniors and what have you with this world can sleep in their own beds at night and make a terrific living and enjoy motorsport much more easily than having to fly and live in Europe and do all that sort of thing. Now, to me, the idea of living in Europe to make my living is fabulous, but not so much everybody. The stories are legion about Mario Andretti going back and forth on Concorde all the time, and how his son tried to do the same, or Michael tried to go back and forth, but that kept him away from the team, away from the garage. They never build up that chemistry that's so important in a successful racing team. So, those are among the main reasons. And I think the lack of a strong American presence, which is changing, by the way, has been difficult. Now we have the Haas team. Of course, the owners of the commercial rights at Liberty Media are here in the United States. Lots of American sponsorship. You start to spot the decals coming up on the cars from things like Dell Technologies and Coca-Cola and Hilton Hotels and what have you. And that's good to see. And I think we are still on the upward curve in terms of Formula One's popularity in America and American involvement in a very intimate way with Formula One as a sport.
Before we go on to the present and how things are changing, I just want to bring back a few memories, let's say, of F1 back in the US. Now, of course, one might instantly go to the damp ones, say Indy 2005, but what was the reaction like in the US to Formula One when you were there, of course, for all those races? Because obviously there is a variety of options available for everyone, but was the atmosphere just a little bit more special, or was it always, as you mentioned, like, oh, it's those guys from across the pond who have come out here, let's just see what it is like as a field trip of sorts? What was it like at the races?
Well, I think there was a certain element of that lack of familiarity, not only with the drivers and teams, but with the technology. What's a Lotus? Of course, everybody knew Ferrari, but the other teams involved, the McLarens and those other squads, were, something foreign and different. And again, there was so much more that people might choose to spend their spectating dollar on. And it was the instability of Formula One that made things more of a niche sport, the wine and cheese crowd, if you will, because you had to make an effort, as I tried to articulate before, to learn about Formula One, to understand it and appreciate it. And we're running into that now with our broadcast audiences. You try to bring everybody up to speed on exactly what they're looking at. That takes a little bit of an effort on the listener or viewer's part. And back then, people just maybe didn't bother quite so much. A lot of people, I think, are surprised to find out that Formula One was attracted to the United States in the first place because the purses paid in the United States were so much greater than what they would win in Europe. I mean, Formula One developed, it hasn't always been the pinnacle, the golden boy of motorsports, if you will. I mean, David Hobbs used to talk all the time about, 165 horsepower Grand Prix engines and, speeds in the low 100+ mile an hour range, as opposed to what we're seeing now, given all the advances in technology. So now you begin to have more of that wow factor. These are incredible machines. And when the likes of Al Unser Jr. or Jeff Gordon say, these are the space shuttles of motorsports, and every driver wants to at least try one, if not race one. And hopefully we're going to get some announcements coming very shortly about a greater American involvement in F1, and hopefully American drivers and American technology. I can tell you the story of the the stillborn USF1 program back in 2010 when Ken Anderson and Peter Windsor tried to put together a Formula One effort.
That's right.
I went to their shops. I
was about to ask you about that because
Okay.
we've seen all those videos on it, and just about to ask you, what was that project like?
It was, I think, a major step in technology and American involvement in Formula One that tragically never was realized. I mean, when you're running a Formula One team, it's like running a cafe or a garage or something. It's a business, and you got to run it like a business, and you have to pay the bills, and you have to comply with laws and all this sort of thing. And they just got so far behind, perhaps because they weren't paying enough attention to those non-motorsports related business matters, that they just couldn't make the bell when the time came. But that car that they were designing was, I think, a phenomenal step forward. A lot of American technology, enhancing some things inside the race car, I'll say, that really would have had an impact, I think. And success, I think, would have come quite quickly for that team, but it wasn't to be. So that was an opportunity missed, I think. And Formula One of those days being run by Bernie Ecclestone, if you didn't come through with what you promised you were going to do, you suddenly became the redheaded stepchild, and you weren't going to get another chance, and all the people around you weren't going to get another chance. So that was a real black eye for American motorsports, and I'm ashamed to say, but it could have been so cool.
But what was it like, sir? Because, of course, you mentioned that technology. It's really a big what if. I mean, the factory, of course, everyone has seen pictures of it, the videos of you presenting the factory to everyone on air. Just what were they working on? What sort of tech was it? I mean, of course, if you can, by the way.
Well, it was, I will say that it was entirely internal, engine, electronics, software, all that sort of thing. Suspension, and aerodynamics as well. I mean, there was some amazing work going on. It was a very experienced staff, and everybody was working their heart out. And that's really all I can say. I can't point to specific nuts and bolts, but what I saw, or what they allowed me to see, was very impressive. And I kind of wonder from time to time where all that intellectual property went. Who knows what was happening and where those ideas took off to, whether we see them in Formula One now or not. But as I say, it was a real problem. But having said that, it went from being a wine and cheese, very niche sport, even in the 80s when I was covering it. And now, we get the turnout. COTA's expecting 360,000 people over 3 days. I think that tells you pretty much everything you need to know as the TV numbers continue to climb, and people get switched on to Formula One. It's a flavor, and more people are beginning to enjoy it.
And why exactly do you think that has happened, sir? Because as you rightly mentioned, the New Jersey race didn't really happen at that time. You mentioned that the USF1 team couldn't quite make it to fruition at that period as well. One might say a little bit of a dark time, but at the same time, Circuit of the Americas was there, and that race turned out to be quite a big one. But the spark, one might say, wasn't quite fully achieved until, let's say, at the start of this particular decade. And have you quite seen the change of an F1 culture per se? Has it been more of a, what can I say, more of an ordinary Joe sport? Has it turned out to be something quite like that nowadays?
Well, I think what you have to understand is the United States has always been a huge prize that Formula One wanted to enhance. They didn't want one race in the United States. They wanted 3. They wanted to come over here, because they were the biggest markets for Mercedes and Ferrari and what have you. They needed to be here in the States, but they, and I say Formula One collectively, made it so difficult. Bernie Ecclestone was demanding $25, $30 million just to bring the circus to town. And not a lot of people can handle that. A lot of people did try. You mentioned the New Jersey race, which actually built their racetrack, but it's so difficult, especially to have a street race in the United States. You're talking about an upfront investment in the area of $100 million, and at the end of it all, what have you got? I mean, you've got a set of grandstands in a warehouse somewhere. You've got a pile of concrete blocks that define the track. but you don't have a physical asset like a permanent racetrack, like a COTA, which was designed. The people behind it were they were knowledgeable about what the investment was going to take. They found that investment and made the track happen. A lot of parties have tried to take races elsewhere in the country. I know there's going to be representatives of Las Vegas, Nevada, in COTA, in Austin, Texas this weekend to talk about the idea of having a race. Not sure it'll ever happen because they want to run it on the Vegas Strip, and you'll never get the owners of all of those casinos to agree. I don't think. I could be wrong. Miami is happening. There are other places that would also like to bring a race to town. Even here in Atlanta, Georgia, was contacted years ago by some folks who said, we want to have a Grand Prix here in Atlanta. How do we go about doing it? And I said, okay, get your bazillion dollars together and we can talk about it. Liberty Media and the Formula One group, which operates the series for Liberty Media, they've taken a much more cooperative, collegial approach, I think, with the existing races, and the cost of putting on those races, fees and stuff are coming down, making them more reasonable, leading to long-term associations with Formula One and places on the calendar. And that has helped a lot as well. As I say, Formula One made it very difficult for a while in the 80s, 90s, early part of the 2000s, until Liberty Media came on the scene and approached it in a much more collegial fashion.
And they've really treated it like a proper asset, this sport. It's tremendous. But
oh, absolutely.
It's such a good point you mentioned. The fact that it's not just a Netflix documentary that has made a change. It's more than just that. But it's amazing how, from the outside, the numbers look so positive. And there are so many people asking questions, like one of our listeners, I know F1, has also asked that the numbers for America right now look so positive after the documentary. Is it really like that? And I suppose one might say things are changing, as you rightly pointed out, with so many people coming in for the race in Texas.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think that's proof of concept right there, is what the Texas numbers show. The Miami ticket sales are going to prove it, I believe. And as the pandemic wanes and people can travel internationally more easily, we'll get that strong South American presence of people from Mexico and the nearby countries who can travel to Texas and to Miami. The Europeans will be coming over because everybody loves coming to the United States. A goodly number of drivers and other personalities in the sport live here.
Yeah.
People like Lewis Hamilton has a place in Colorado. Michael Schumacher had a ranch in Oklahoma. People love coming to the United States. So that underlying enthusiasm for the sport, even if it's only manifested by watching the races on television on the weekends, it's there. And people are paying attention to Formula One in a way they never did before. And American drivers are paying attention to Formula One the way they never did before. And I think we're going to see a boost in that in the very near future, hopefully. And we'll see what happens. But it's great. And if we could get a third race here in the United States, so much the better. Although, as you I'm sure know, it's becoming very difficult. The teams are starting to provide some blowback regarding the size of the schedule, and 23 races now and the possibility of 25 down the road.
Yeah.
Teams are not crazy about that idea, so we'll see what happens.
I think it just dilutes the value of each race, honestly. But it's ridiculous that F1 is trying so much. And that's a good thing to see, that they are taking positive steps. But positive steps had also been taken outside of Liberty Media's control. Now, there is a possibility that Andretti could, of course, get a hold into Sauber. There is a possibility that Colton Herta might come into Formula One, or Patricio Ward, who, of course, has been impressing quite a fair bit for Smith Peterson McLaren back in IndyCar. This just sounds like good times. There's more representation in a way, and it was a bit of a lull period with not many drivers making the jump after Montoya, of course, but this is, of course, nice to see with the sport gaining popularity. What would you have to say about this whole shift in change? Although it's not completely dramatic, but it's still getting there, and that's the good point.
Well, Formula One is a young man's sport, so you're not going to see the 35 to 40-year-old super successful American drivers want to go to Formula One. It's going to be the 19 and 20 and 21-year-olds. It'll be the guys in the Colton Herta, Kyle Kirkwood, the new Indy Lights champion, guys like that. Pato O'Ward, you mentioned, yeah, he could fit the bill. I tell you, this Andretti rumor mill has been fun to follow. Michael told me in a gathering at COTA, gosh, a decade ago, when I asked him about would he like to have a Formula One team, he said, absolutely. It's unfinished business for me. Now, here we are 10 years or so later, and the rumors are strong that he may be able to make that happen. And I hope he can. It's curious that there are rumors about Colton Herta getting right in the car. You know, Alain Prost wrote a book about his experience in Formula One. I think it's called Life in the Fast Lane.
Yep.
In which he talked about his first toe in the water with Formula One. He was offered a test. I believe it was McLaren, but it was a public test where all the teams would be present and all the media and all that sort of thing. And Prost said, I won't do it unless, and he was just coming out of Formula 3, I believe, successful, but had not driven a Formula One car. And he said, I will only do it if I get a day or two of private testing so I can learn the race car, what it's capable of, before I go out in public and try to do this, which I thought was a really wise move, so that he not blot his copybook, if you will, the very first time he gets in the car. Now, as good as Colton and Pato and all those guys are, I can't imagine getting out of even an Indy car these days and getting into a Formula One car and looking at that array of technology in front of you and the 6 engineers and 12 mechanics all gathered around the cockpit when you get in the car, and think you're going to go out there and actually put on a reasonable show and represent yourself well. In the people I've been talking with behind the scenes about the possibility of Colton or any other young driver getting in the car, I would certainly ask that they follow the Alain Prost method and do the testing in private and get all those days of simulator time, which can be such a helpmate to young drivers right now that we didn't have back in the 80s and 90s, and learn your craft in a Formula One car, a contemporary Formula One car, before you go out there in front of the guys of the world and try to find your place in one of the most elite sports in the world.
Exactly. No, it's such a big shift, and it's intriguing to see that Formula One drivers now are also making the shift. I wouldn't say back to IndyCar, but they're also making the shift to IndyCar now with Grosjean and Marcus Ericsson. And that's it's curious times to see both sides of the pond meeting together and everything coming across so well. But I'm very curious about your take on Haas. Earlier on the podcast, you mentioned that them coming on, it had a bit of an impact. Was it a really big impact to see, say, Haas in Formula One on the American side of things? Obviously, they've not been very good lately, but still, it must make a bit of a difference. But has it quite been what many expected it would to stir that sort of reaction?
That's a good question. The Haas situation is a little bit different, and perhaps, and this is a bit of a stretch, but it's akin to Red Bull in that, Dietrich Mateschitz, Mr. Red Bull, wanted a Formula One team, not so much to win a world championship, although they've succeeded greatly in that regard. But Red Bull is essentially a marketing company going racing. They want to spread the good word about Red Bull drinks. Haas is a bit like that, I think. Gene Haas made the investment because he has this fabulous company making computerized milling machines. And he wanted to get those machines into every garage in the or a factory in the Formula One world and other sports beside. And I think he succeeded in that. But along the way, he has come smack into the reality that this is a technical crucible in Formula One, unlike any other in motorsports. And you've really got to dig in. Gene Haas's stock car team buys technology from the Richard Childress or the Rick Hendricks of the world, off the shelf, chassis, engines, all this kind of stuff. So it's relatively easy if you have the resources to put together a stock car team and compete in NASCAR Cup racing. Whether you're going to be successful takes you back to the old Jack Roush engines motto that, speed costs. If you want to go fast, do you want to be competitive? There's a big price difference between the two. And I think that's what Haas has come across, is that it is so difficult to get the right combination of resources, of engineering talent, design talent, drivers, all the things you need. And he's gotten frustrated by the fact that he hasn't been able to succeed. That is, even though he has bought that off-the-shelf technology from Ferrari and from Dallara, and, as he's able to put a team out there. But if you want to be competitive, the price goes up. Now, that doesn't mean they can't do it. They haven't done it yet, and you're right that they started out scoring points in their debut, and it was a dream come true for them. But it's been a much tougher road since then. I don't think they're there yet. I hope they will be in the near future. Of course, there's rumors about big injections from Nikita Mazepin's old man, who's a billionaire. We just will have to wait and see if things play out. But I think Gene Haas would be the first to tell you that he had to make a big adjustment to his own planning, as well as his original commitment to Formula One, to go out there, and really compete with the big boys.
Yeah, let's hope that they can muster up something special for 2022 when the regulations change. It would mean a lot to see Haas doing well. There's obviously
absolutely. Yeah.
this element of Formula One coming up with more races in the US, the sport gaining more popularity. What could be better than having a team that does well at the end of the day?
Yeah,
that's.
But there's no silver bullet.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a grind. It's a complete package with a lot of parts, moving pieces, if you will, and they're not there yet. It's as simple as that. And I hope they've signed up for the new Concord Agreement, so they're committed to the sport for years to come. And I hope they can make that big step, at least into the midfield, and battle with the Ferraris and McLarens and the Aston Martins of the world.
Well, assuming if they stay in the midfield, because this year Ferrari and McLaren both are just punching the envelope a little bit more. It's amazing to see. But we've got a couple of listener questions, and they're actually quite relevant, and they're asking something interesting. There's one from Gitansh, who's asking, does F1 need so many races in the USA? Now, of course, there's COTA, there's Miami coming in. I suppose Miami was, from what I heard, sir, and correct me if I'm wrong, a bit of an agreement, no? When Liberty bought out the stake from CVC, that one of the promoters involved wanted to race in Miami for them to be able to purchase the stake or something quite like that. So that's why Formula One just went bonkers on getting it done. But does F1 need more, or is two enough? Or rather, why do we even need two when we've already got one?
Well, that's a good question. You'd have to ask Formula One. And I'm sure it's a part and parcel of their business plan. As I mentioned earlier, everybody wants races in the United States because they are so high profile and they bring so much attention to the sport, so much financial input to the sport, I think, is the reality. So, if one race is good, two races is better. Certainly other countries have had 2 or 3 races.
Yeah.
Germany has had them. Italy has had them. So, it's not unusual. Whether they actually need it, perhaps not. I think what Formula One needs to do, even more than have multiple races in the United States, is to make the sport more affordable, more equitable in terms of the prize money. I mean, we went for years with this farcical distribution of billions of dollars in prize money to the teams, so that, in short, the most successful teams got the most money by an exponential factor over the teams at the back who really needed more of that money in order to improve. Now, Liberty has gone a long way towards addressing that, and they've taken other steps like the cost cap, which has certainly affected the enthusiasm for guys like Gene Haas to remain in the sport. Just leveling that playing field a bit. I'd like to see him bring the cost of Formula One tickets down. I think you'd see a huge uptick in the number of people who attend races live all over the world if it wasn't going to take a month's wages to buy a single ticket to go sit in the grandstand. I mean, it's pure, promotion 101, if you will. You've got to make the experience a good time for the fans, or they'll just tune out and you risk losing them.
Exactly. No, it's still good to see the numbers on the rise, and Liberty are being conscious about it. They're recognizing that there are flaws in the way things were working out, and they're making changes. Of course, the headline one being Netflix, but these small things, as you rightly mentioned as well, being more cooperative, it means that more of the spotlight is going to the main show, going to the fight between Verstappen and Hamilton and the likes of McLaren versus Ferrari. And obviously, so now, being a motorsport fan, being in the sport for so long, there must be a part of your heart that goes racing a little bit more to finally see a fight for the title. And I suppose this is one of the things that should really help the popularity aspect of it, that at least in the next edition of Drive to Survive, we will see 2 battles for the championship, if not just one driver at the top.
Yes, definitely. I must admit, I'm I'm of two minds about that whole idea that, oh, one car dominates, one driver wins all the races, all the championships, that sort of thing. I've been involved with Formula One through the eras of Mansell in his championship year when he won everything, McLaren when they won everything between Prost and Senna, when Senna dominated for years and winning 3 championships. Michael Schumacher dominated for years after he helped Ferrari right the ship in the 90s and into the 2000s. So there have been those periods of domination. And I always said, particularly with regard to Michael Schumacher, years from now, fans of the sport are going to want to say, I was watching. I saw Michael Schumacher in action. I saw these guys race. And we'll forget all about the fact that they won 13 of the 18 races, or whatever it might happen to be. Formula One is a many-faceted sport. It's as much a technology war as it is an actual athletic contest among the drivers. And when I got into Formula One early on, if you designed a car that would lap the field 5 times and win the race, you got all the kudos and everybody loved you. You do that now in recent years, and it's like, oh my God, this is horrible when one team is just killing it. Well, yeah, they're killing it because they're doing something very special, and that's kind of fun to watch. I mean, the greatest one-off you could find there would be Ross Brawn's Brawn GP team when Jenson Button won his title in 2009. They slaughtered everybody because they put their efforts into developing a technological tweak called the double diffuser that gave them a competitive advantage no one else could match. So, we all sat back and said, wow, that's something special. And that made the year special, and it made the sport special. So, you have to have that room for innovation. Dan Gurney always used to say that, you have to be able to go out and come up with a new widget, something nobody else has, nobody thought about or couldn't make work. And when you do that, you have success and you deserve every bit of it.
Hence the Gurney flap that eventually came about in the world of racing.
Absolutely.
He is such a pioneer. Oh man! But who would you have? Who would you put your money on for this year? Because that's been the question raging on everyone's mind. Heading into Circuit of the Americas, it's more of a traditional Mercedes track per se. But really, this year you just can't say. And honestly, that's the best part of it. That's what helps the sport grow eventually.
Absolutely. Boy, I'd hate to have a gun in my head and be forced to pick the champion this year, because not only because Lewis and Max are very different personalities, but equally competitive.
Yeah.
Each has strengths and weaknesses, but they're very competitive with each other. But you have so many other factors that enter into it now. The first one has to be engine life. The fact that everybody has used up their allowable 3 engines and the other 5 component parts that go into a power unit. And so now they've got to start introducing a 4th and maybe a 5th and taking the kind of grid penalties we've seen in recent races. And neither Max nor Lewis can afford to go back to 10th by changing 1 or 2 components, or all the way to the back, as Max did when he changed the entire power unit setup. So you have that factor. We're going to have to take another power unit, and when do we do it to minimize the damage? You've also got interesting tracks coming up. They're going to race for the first time in Qatar.
Yeah.
Nobody's tested there. Nobody has an idea what's going to happen. Abu Dhabi has changed its configuration of its track a little bit for the season finale. So that's going to be a factor. And then there's the things you can't predict, like weather and what have you. I mean, there are so many things. This is going to be, I think, the most exciting 6-race stretch in recent years as Max and Lewis go at it for 2 different teams in wildly differing circumstances in each of those 6 races. It's just going to be fascinating to watch. And let's not overlook the role of the number 2 drivers in these teams. Sergio Perez for Max Verstappen at Red Bull, and of course the outgoing Valtteri Bottas for Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton. Bottas did exactly what he needed to do in the most recent race in Turkey. Lewis was having problems, couldn't get up onto the podium. So Valtteri won the race with a terrific performance, especially in light of the fact that he's leaving the team at the end of the year. But that's what the number 2 needs to do, get up there and deny your team leaders, rivals points by taking them away, winning the race, or at least scoring well. So this next 6 races is going to be a lot of fun.
Dare I say the final might be a lot like London Season 2 for Formula E, a race that of course, you saw in person a race where not season 2, season 1, wasn't it? Where Degrassi and Buemi clashed. Something quite
Degrassi and
like,
Buemi crashed it.
yeah.
Yeah, the corner in the. Yeah, I mean, there could be. I'd hate to see that. Let me say that. The collision at Silverstone, the collision at Monza, that was unfortunate. You don't expect that from the elite drivers. I mean, yeah, you're competitive, and yeah, you want the other guy to back up first, but someone made this point. I think it might have been Mark Hughes, a great Formula One writer, who said that Lewis has been in this position before.
Yeah.
He hasn't always battled for a championship, but he knows how to protect a championship lead by knowing discretion's a better part of valor. If you can't take 25 points, take 18.
Yeah.
Can't get that, take 15. Take whatever the car in the race will give you. Max, on the other hand, is more in the Senna mode. It's just flat. All I want to do is win the darn race. Just I'll dive for every opening. And the result is you can throw it all away and get 0 points. And Max has never been in that position where he had to protect something. He's always been the attacker. And that in turn means Lewis has to think about that when he's going into a corner. He may say, I'm not going to lift anymore for Max. Well, maybe not. Again, it'll be fun to watch.
Oh, absolutely. Man, I can't wait to see how these last 6 races go. But before we conclude with the episode, sir, you mentioned a name that rung a bell, Senna. You've seen him in action a little bit. You've seen the likes of Prost, the likes of Mansell, of course, in your very first race, as you mentioned early on. From your time of broadcasting in Formula One, what are the few really memorable memories that come to your mind?
Oh, wow.
Especially with those guys, because so many of us have just heard stories and just adds to the legend of it, makes it feel even more special.
Gosh, there have been so many down over the years. Certainly since Senna's not been with us, since he was killed in '94, those moments that I was able to share with him were something special. Seeing him on and off the racetrack, the way he conducted himself, doing interviews with him, and giving him the opportunity to expand a little bit. And he could be very, very eloquent about why he does what he does and how he judges himself and those around him. So those interviews, there was only 2 or 3 that I will always remember, in addition to the extraordinary drives in places like Suzuka. Michael Schumacher was another of those guys that I was able to share journalistic time with, although Michael was a much more private individual than even Senna. It's so difficult to choose. Just having been around these people, and I give them all the time in the world because they are so put upon by the journos and the fans and their teams and all the time they have to spend with engineers and debriefs and all that kind of thing. So it's rare and getting rarer that you actually have time to have a word with these guys. Some are incredibly sociable. You may bump into them in a cafe somewhere and share a good moment. Some of them are intensely private. Sebastian Vettel is an interesting character, and I hadn't had a lot of time to be around him. But he is one of those guys who can be incredibly eloquent and engaging at the racetrack, as long as you don't touch his private life, not his partner, not his children, not his investment in the Beatles musical catalog, not in the vintage cars that he's buying. He is a man of really interesting and eclectic tastes, but that is all off the record. Has no presence on social media, cuts his own contract deals, does not have an agent. He's a really fascinating character from that perspective. And because the drivers have so little time to share, and all of them share it in different ways, any time that you could spend face-to-face with one of them, even not necessarily the big stars, the guys further down the pack who are bringing sponsorship and flying commercial and sharing bedrooms and all that kind of stuff. These are the young guys who always had this dream and now they've got it, and away we go. If I had to pick the driver who has been the most fun to chat with in my years, I'd probably go with Rubens Barrichello. who was just a fabulous guy and able to separate track life from off-track life. Assuming we put Alex Zanardi aside. Alex was number one, but his spell in Formula One was so brief. I got to know him through his Champ Car years, and he's my number one personality. But Barrichello at the racetrack was always probably the easiest chat.
What about Montoya, though? It just sparked up in my head right now because there's an obvious connection. Montoya, of course, he was successful on both sides of the pond, which very few people have actually been able to do. But this spell in Formula One just ended abruptly. Of course, he came back to NASCAR, but what was he like? What was he received like? Because it really intrigues me. Of course, for the rest of the world, he's just like, he had so much of talent, but he couldn't quite get anything done. But he got things done back in the US. Was the perception around him ever like, oh, he's quote unquote the bad boy or someone who just does what he likes to do? What's it with him? It's really intriguing.
Well, there's certainly an element of that. I think Juan Pablo was one of the most naturally talented drivers I've ever seen. I mean, he can get in anything and make it go fast. And you're right, he never really achieved the ultimate dream, you might say, but he was the kind of guy, who that just doesn't matter to him. It's like water off a duck's back. He loves to go out and drive the race car. He's a much more deep thinker about it than people probably give him credit for. You're right. They think of him as the bad boy or the party boy or the laissez-faire individual who's not going to give you any revealing insights. But in fact, he's a very loyal, very generous guy. He does think deeply about what he is doing and has worked very hard to get where he is, coming out of Colombia, which is not, a country that comes to mind first when we think about countries that produce great racing drivers. Yeah. So he's had tremendous spirit and tremendous confidence in himself. And he's another great one. He's fun to talk to, appreciates a joke. And he's been one of the great all-rounders. I mean, yes, he came back to NASCAR and didn't quite get that done, but my old colleague Dario Franchitti would be the first to tell you stock cars are a very different animal than an open-wheeled car, than an Indy car where he had so much success. Dario just, he would tell he was useless in a stock car, and he figured that out and, went back. But Juan Pablo did it in an Indy car, was competitive, if not, maybe necessarily championship material in stock cars, but he also had big success in sports cars, winning at the Rolex 24 at Daytona, still gets in a sports car from time to time, raced at Le Mans last year, I believe. And he is bringing up, I should say, a bit of a stable of young drivers that from South America that, may or may not be superstars in the making, but he has not forgotten where he came from and what he can do to help young drivers overcome some of the obstacles he has faced and overcome. Just a good guy and a great talent. He definitely has a good place in motorsports history in multiple categories.
Man, such a fun thing to hear insights all throughout this episode. So it really means a lot that you came on and have a word with us. But before we go, I'm going to go a little bit selfish on this one. And it's just a question that we all have to ask, right? What advice would you give to people wanting to become like you? Now, one thing I notice and one thing I want to bring in me that is something quite like you is the composure and the articulation. But there's the element of preparation that comes in just setting in the tone. But those are the more technical things. What would you say to someone who's just starting out on this journey?
I'm the last guy to ask, to be honest, because as I mentioned at the top of the show, I was never meant to be an announcer. I was going to be a lawyer here in Atlanta or elsewhere. So I didn't go through the traditional academic preparation for the job. I didn't go to a TV or film school. I learned on the job, and I had a great opportunity to do that. And hopefully I was able to exploit all of the opportunities that came my way now and in the future. So I often hear from young people saying, okay, I'm in this program at this university or that college, and how do I get a job in motorsports broadcasting? I have no idea. My job found me. But that's an overstatement, I suppose. You get in where you can, and it's tough finding a job in the business. So maybe you don't come in as the host and play-by-play person on the Grand Prix of Monaco. It just doesn't happen quite that way. But if you get in at any broadcast entity in any sport, and look for your opportunities, and maybe you're not a broadcaster earlier on. Maybe you're a cameraman or a video editor or whatever it might happen to be. It doesn't help in that regard that we do so much remotely these days, because that means there's fewer jobs on site. But there's still a lot out there. And so I would recommend to anybody to get their foot in the door any way they can. And don't overlook radio, which is a great training ground, because of course, your voice paints the whole picture for the listener. They don't have TV pictures in front of them to let them use their own imagination. And it could be at your local station, TV or radio. It can be at your local racetrack, doing PA or writing articles for the local papers, or maybe one of the national websites. Start your own website, get your name out there, show yourself at events, let people know what you want to do. I think that it's pretty self-evident. You've got to get out there and hustle, and just forget about being a wallflower, because wallflowers don't get jobs. You've got to get out there and show what you can do. But that doesn't have to happen at the highest level. You start low and work your way up. So that would be my advice.
And so what's next for you? I'm really so excited to see you on TV screens, on more races, and it just doesn't have to be cars, that also.
Well, that's a good question. I'm doing Extreme E, as you mentioned, but that's 5 weekends a year with Fox. But there are other series out there. There are relatively few people who do what I do. So whenever I talk about what I'd like to do, I hate the idea of spinning somebody else out of a gig. And most of the networks, if they're involved in motorsports, they have set lineups, and that's all well and good. So I've kind of positioned myself as waiting by the phone, if you will, totally remembering what I said about wallflowers. Let people know you're out there. We did some social media work at Indianapolis this weekend with the IGTC and GT America series. Maybe some more of that. It's hard to say who out there might be looking to make a change or start something new. This podcast business is intriguing, but frankly, it looks like a lot of work. You guys do a great job, but I'm sure it takes a lot of your time and effort. It's interesting, although I'd like to work more, it's interesting to be in this position where I can kind of take a step back and look around and think about what I really want to do. I've always loved to travel. This business has taken me all over the world for one sport or another, working with one great personality or another. I love telling stories. And you mentioned my use of language. People used to say, well, do you regret those years of law school and those years in the profession? And I say, no, absolutely not, because what I like to do is tell stories. And to me, that's a version of advocacy, which is what lawyers do. And the law training teaches you to use language and to research thoroughly and all those sorts of things. So I look back on those years in law school pretty fondly in terms of what it taught me that I can put to use in this sport. So you step back, look around, and then try to position yourself to pick up something nice for next year. And that's what I'm doing right now.
Fingers crossed that comes across. But genuinely, thank you for taking all the time to speak to us today. And folks, I hope you've had a good time listening. I know I certainly, I wish you could see this if you're listening to this on the audio version. I was just beaming from ear to ear, but that's just the kind of stuff that happens. But thank you once again for making all the time. And thank you for listening, folks. You know the deal. If you like this episode, just leave a like, leave a good review, subscribe, share. You know it long enough, right? You've been listening to us long enough for that. But once again, thank you, and just give us a subscribe and keep an eye out on our USGP coverage as well. We're coming up with a lot of good stuff, including the preview, the review, and a couple of more special episodes as well. So once again, folks, see you soon, and I hope you had a good time.